What does it take to navigate the evolving landscapes of technology and leadership? How can systems guide us through complexity? Today, we are joined by Kevin Henrikson, a technologist, entrepreneur, and pilot. From co founding Acompli, which was acquired by Microsoft and became Outlook Mobile, to leading engineering teams at Microsoft and Instacart, Kevin has been at the forefront of building and scaling impactful technology. In this conversation, we will unpack Kevin's journey through startups and big tech, discuss the importance of systems in scaling teams, examine the evolving landscape of AI and the future of work, and uncover how his experience as a pilot informs his approach to leadership and innovation. Kevin, thank you so much for being here.
Awesome, man. Thanks for having me. This is exciting.
Very good. So, Kevin, you transitioned from co-founding startups like Acompli to leading engineering teams at major companies like Microsoft and Instacart. Can you walk us through your career trajectory and the pivotal moments that shaped you?
Yeah. So starting off, I was born in Oakland, California. Grew up on a pig farm in Central California, with my brothers and sister. And yeah, I went to school in LA, actually for mechanical engineering. But, kind of in the late 90s, being, that first time getting connected to the internet, it was just like software became so much of a passion of mine and internet software. And so transitioned sort of into software right after college and spent about 18 years doing email.
Right.
Had one small startup before that that was not email, but then after that did a lot of email. And like I said, kind of finishing with the one that you described, Acompli, which was a mobile app that Microsoft acquired. And then they subsequently, 6 weeks later renamed it to Outlook Mobile, and then scaled that to 100 millions of users and for a few years. And then after that, went to a company called Instacart. They had about 50 engineers at the time, and sort of nobody would have guessed at that point. But a few months later, the pandemic hit, and Instacart went from a nice to have sort of luxury service of grocery delivery to sort of a, essential service and sort of bringing food to people that, couldn't leave their homes for good and bad reasons. And so that team scaled to, thousands of engineers, almost 2,000 engineers
Wow.
in the next year or so. And then, yeah, now kind of working in AI. And so, I think, sort of went from, if you think of it, Web 0 to Web 1, Web 2 with that early JavaScript stuff, mobile first, kind of then the sharing economy with Instacart, and now AI. And always have just been always excited about what's next, and how can you take sort of technology and bring it to business, and sort of the classic entrepreneur sort of capitalist view of the world.
Right. It's an amazing story. So from big farm to leading, huge engineering teams, what was your first exposure to computers? Was it at the big farm? You were already like messing around with computers, or did that happen in LA? When did it start?
Yeah. So my dad was a pilot, so was in the Navy, and then was a commercial pilot. Flew for an airline called Flying Tigers, which got acquired by FedEx, and so flew long haul flights. And so he was gone, about 2 weeks a month. He'd be gone for 2 weeks and then come back because the flights were long through Asia and whatnot. And one day he came home with a computer. And it was a large scale laptop. It looked like a desktop. It was, the size of a briefcase.
Right.
And he had got it from a friend of his or something. And he's like, oh, my kids would love to play with this. And so brought it home. And I was probably fifth or sixth grade at the time, I would guess, when we first got exposed to it. But again, no internet, no, we didn't even have dial up at that point. But that was the first sort of idea. And then, throughout the time would, every couple years would get it was called Price Club, which is now Costco in the US. But we would get a computer like a Packard Bell, which is the original. So HP, that
Yeah.
before it kind of, Packard became HP. And then, compact computer, and then, sort of Dell's later on. And every couple years we get a new computer, we'd read the books. My dad was not, a technologist. He flew airplanes and knew how, that kind of stuff worked, like the small computer that was in the airplane. But no, we were very self-taught. We got dial-up internet at some point. And so the first software I remember writing was literally we would get these magazines, and my mom was a school teacher, and so she knew how to type, like on a traditional typewriter.
Right.
And so you would get literally the program would be in the magazine. So you'd have like a slot machine. I remember was one of the first things we had was like a very simple slot machine, and she literally typed all the code out, copying it from a magazine, basic, and then we would get it working, and we'd have to debug it or it wouldn't work because there'd be typos, or it was amazing, right? And like you would record it and save it to a cassette tape. And then eventually we got some basic games and floppy disks, the big ones, the small ones, all that good stuff. And then we got dial-up internet and sort of experienced like bulletin boards and kind of chat rooms and sort of just learning like, oh,
Right.
you could talk to people that weren't in your town or around the world. It was, in a very early sort of naive discovery of that. But then getting to UCLA and having like real internet, so Ethernet in the dorms where you had a computer that had like high speed internet like we know it today.
Mm.
Nothing as high speed as it is today, but it was, it was very fast because it was a corporate, it was a kind of a enterprise network. Um, and then it was music sharing. And so Travis Kalanick, who started Uber, was 1 year ahead of me in school. And so he was doing this thing called Scour. And so we would share MP3s between our computers, and everybody had like a C, it was all Windows machines. So C colon MP3, and we'd have our files and we'd be sharing music with each other. And so just those early days of like kind of discovering it. But I just fell in love with the idea of like, building software. And I remember the first thing I wrote on the farm that was like custom software was like a very simple like index card system to just store the name of all the pigs. We have hundreds of pigs and like what their feed was and when they were born and like, almost like a little bit of a pig resume, if you can laugh at, is like a very simple CRM system for organizing the pigs when they had last had babies, how many babies they had, who's the family, little family tree action. So yeah, that was kind of my first thing. And then obviously, stumbling into the internet and building web pages and things like that, it kind of went crazy kind of post college.
What drives you? Is it being able to create something and put it out there and get a feedback loop so quickly? Is it about solving a problem, automating a process? What's the biggest driver for you?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's like the capitalistic view of like I can build things and make money and build a business. And like
Right.
I like love the idea of building businesses. In college, I had a business that was computer embroidery. So I had like a sewing machine connected to my laptop, and where I could print out like, letters and stitch it into like it was like a very simple automated embroidery machine. And I would make sweatshirts and t-shirts for the fraternities and sororities on campus and then some other schools. And so that was like my first thing. Like I got a business license in Los Angeles County and registered with the tax authority to buy thread for the machine. And just the idea of like I was just been fascinated with business. And the idea of like making things. And part of that goes back to the farm, right? You would grow these animals, you would feed them corn, they would get bigger, you would take them to the auction, and then somebody would give you money for that. And I was like, wow, dude,
Right.
we, put in, you know, it was funny because you'd probably put in like $30 or $40 of food, over a certain lifetime of the pig or $50 a pig, and then you would sell the pig for 300. And I'm like, wait a minute, you could take $30 of corn and sell the pig for 300. That's crazy. Now, of course, I'm discounting the fact that my parents bought the farm and had a loan and like we were all like child labor working for free. Like, but the idea that like you could have an input and have an output and they were very different was exciting to me. And then with software, started to see that evolve in a very different way. And so for me, it was always about this kind of like end goal being quite frankly capitalistic. But like as I got larger and larger into companies, or hey, now I'm working for building something. And what I figured out was like, hey, I can write so much code and have more impact. And then if I manage the team, now I have 10 people that are having impact. If I start the company, now I have the whole company, So it just kind of scaled up from there of like, how can you have more impact? And how can you solve problems? And now, of course, 30 years later, right? Sort of I'm 48. Now you look at like, wow, there's really big things in the world and you have really big ideas. How can you go approach those and what's the right way? And so now we're actually starting companies with other entrepreneurs and, sort of almost acting like a venture studio, building and mentoring other engineers. And I know you're like really big into outsourcing and like I've seen a lot of that sort of in your background. And, I've spent over $3 million on Upwork over the last, 20 years. Hired, I think like 700 resources, about 300,000 hours of outsourced tasks. And
Wow.
so I've always been big on like, how do I have more impact? How do I scale more teams? And so to me, that's always been something that I'm fascinated with. But the end goal is like, how can you have more output for a given business, whether that's your business or the customers and the businesses you're working with?
As you continue to now venture into new businesses, does the industry matter to you, or as long as you can make an impact and there's that play between input and output, that you're having fun?
Yeah, I think it does. You have to be interested in it. And so I think, I think there's industries that I'm honestly, if I had another or three or four body doubles, I'd work in more industries because there's lots of industries that are interesting to me. personally really excited about healthcare and like what that can be and how big that is. And, seeing my dad go through his health journey, my own kind of like health journey of like how I've, tried to get healthier and things of that nature and the impact that health has. Um, I think the other thing to me when I'm looking at companies or ideas is like the idea that innovation and technology can make a big difference.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that today I even challenge myself with is thinking hard about while technology is great and like I can go do things to nerd out on my own sort of like passion or technology, is there resistance to that technology coming into a new industry? And so, like healthcare, for example, there's a lot of resistance. Some of the stuff we're doing with voice AI, a lot of resistance. I'm working with some really large established industry players in some of these other sort of sectors, and there's a lot of resistance and scaredness of technology. They're still doing the things they did at 30, 40 years ago, but I don't think that's any different than if you look back 10 or 20 years ago where there was people that are like, there's no way I want my company on the internet. I don't want to use a mobile phone. I don't want to use digital payments. So there's been a lot of these transitions where the early adopters move quickly, but there's like that kind of sort of big middle and then the late adopters that take more time. And so for me, when I look at an industry, it's like one where I think I care enough about it to be excited and passionate about it. But two is like, what is the approach to bring technology and bring the way that you and I would think is being like more on the forefront of technology to a business that doesn't have that? And how can you do that in a way that's not scary for them, that actually feels like they're making progress? And so to me, it's really a cross section of those of like really big market. Technology can make a really big impact. And then you have to weigh that against like the resistance of, the kind of incumbents. And many times it's not just the incumbents, it's like the people that are around that, right? It's like, I think of it like in the old days with VMware, right? They were virtualizing CPUs and soft and hardware and stuff like that. And so you'd walk into an office building in the 90s or even early 2000s, and they would have lots of servers like in the closet in the office. And you're like, hey guys, we're going to move all this to a cloud. And that's scary because the guy every day that would walk in and babysit those servers and coddle them and update them, and now his like, wait, like my office is going away. That means I could go away, right? And so I think that is the natural thing, but not realizing that like, hey, you can retool your brain to be like, become an expert in this. Let's not babysit replacing hard drives and babysit hardware and the air conditioning and all the things that required to set up a data center. And now you can have more impact by having, 5 times the number of servers and resources in the cloud. And then you can just become, obviously you can have more impact. And like, but people don't think about that as the first move.
So right now with AI, you're working with AI, and will you say that there's a little bit of that larger companies have a harder time leveraging AI? And I don't mean, of course, there are the frontier model companies, not all, right? But the big corporations that to make a change, it's all this legal compliance and change
Yeah.
management stuff. Do you see a huge opportunity there to leverage?
I do. And I think there's a couple ways that you see the resistance show up, right? So there's companies that like, I'll give you a good example. We were talking to like one of the major insurance companies in the US, and they spend millions of dollars a year with Salesforce as a very simple example. And they still have not turned on the AI features in Salesforce. So this isn't like using AI or using it. This is literally just this is not like using a frontier model. This is like leveraging a frontier model that's integrated with the data. So you've already trusted Salesforce with all of your data and all of your information, but you're afraid to have an AI algorithm run on top of that because you just don't know what's going to happen or output. So that's like one level of resistance, which I think two things are going to happen. One is eventually the leadership that's sort of making the decision to prevent that from happening will get replaced, or you'll start to see new startups and new entrants come in that, or even their competitors that adopt. Like if one insurance company adopts AI and goes full send on it, they're just going to be that much better. They're going to make better decisions. They're going to be faster. They're going to be more efficient. They're going to have more people delivering output to the end customer than they are going to be spending internally, right? Healthcare is a great example. For every time they hire one doctor or one nurse, they hire 3 administrative people, right? Because you're like, you need a front desk person, you need somebody doing billing, you need somebody doing insurance, and not always is it 1-to-1, but it's like insane how many extra people come along, and you're like, wait a minute, they're not providing customer, value, right? Like they're providing like this overhead. And so you're like, wait, if the doctor can come in and AI can be the admin, the billing, and the, sort of insurance resource, the doctor can actually see more patients, spend less time on the administrative stuff, and have a more efficient practice because they're not spending. And so to me, there's different ways that we see that resistance show up. Sometimes it is big company compliance, but it's also even in a big company. I have friends at a big company where they've said, hey, we're going to move, the entire development team should be using AI. And after 6 months, you go run a test, less than half of the team's actually using AI every day
Yeah.
to write code. And
Yeah.
you're like, okay, well, at this point, we should literally fire or lay off everybody that hasn't used AI. Because if you're not trying every day to test this, it's like showing up to build a house and saying, I refuse to use the nail gun. All I'm going to use is a hammer. And you're like, look, man, there is a time when the hammer makes sense and the nail gun makes sense. But if you're refusing to use the nail gun, or you're refusing to use the electric saw and you're only using the handsaw, you're just not going to be efficient and you're actually hurting yourself and the company. We need to find a different place for you to go do that work. Go do like, antique crafting or something where you're going to do it without power, and, go be an Amish sort of like, craftsman where you're going to do it in the old style and then be rewarded in that way. But to work in a modern place where modern construction is moving forward with nail guns and electric saws, not using AI tools as an employee at any level or as a founder at any level today, I think is, it's just negligent in terms of your ability to have the most impact on what you're doing. And at the very least, in educating yourself on what's possible.
Yeah. So you said the future won't be AI versus humans. It's AI plus humans beating everyone else. Can you elaborate on this perspective and the implications in the workforce?
Yeah. I think anybody that's used AI today, you can ask it a question and it might be a better Google, right? If you ask, Grok something that happened today, it's going to give you a good answer. If you ask Perplexity something that happened this month, it'll give you a good answer. If you ask ChatGPT something that happened in the last year, and with the new models, even some of the more recent stuff, it gives you a great answer, right? Factual information, very easy to retrieve information. When you ask it to do a task, it depends on how much context it has and what tools it has access to.
Yep.
And so my view is that today, there's many things that still require human in the loop or human on the loop. And so while human in the loop is the old one where it's like AI does something, human helps move it forward, I think there'll be a world where we start to act on human on the loop, where you're actually watching multiple of these agents do work and you're giving them tips and texts and they're checking in with you, but you're not actually doing the work. You're literally coaching them. I think the great example is like Devin.ai. It's a coding agent. It's an agentic coding approach. And so when I work with Devin, I just give it feedback like I would give a junior engineer. So let's just take, and let's say I was working with your company and I've outsourced, my development, and I'm giving you tasks and your team tasks. I'll give them things. They'll give me feedback. I'll give them feedback. Every couple of days we'll check in, or every day. I can now do that with Devin, right? I can just give it instructions. It does some things. Let's just say it gets 80% of the stuff right? And I think that's very typical of like an offshore team, or when you're onboarding a new junior person, you're like, hey, there's some things that just don't understand. Oh, they put the date formats or the phone formats in their local country and not in US format, like little things that are just cultural insensitivities. And then you're like, hey, man, you need to put that in US format. Okay. And then they'll just do it, right? It's not a hard thing. You just need to flag it. And so my view is that the human is still going to be required, just because AI is still pretty naive and junior in its approach. It doesn't have that full context. Now, over the coming years, there will get more context and the humans will get to do more and be more efficient. And the type of coaching they have to do will be removed because like the AI models and the AI agents have learned. But I think it'll be a long time where we get complete like autonomy of like the whole thing's running without a human. For the complexity of tasks that I'm thinking about, right? For simple things, like I can go do lead generation, or I can go do research, or I can, put these agentic tools in a leap. Like we have a big process inside. We use N8N, which is like a agentic framework. And it does great. It's like, hey, I want to go find all of the HVAC professionals in Columbus, Ohio, and all the people that have a pool in Bethesda, Maryland. And it can go do that, right? It can loop over that. We teach it how to go do it, and it just runs. But if I'm like, now go build the best software package for, plumbers in Toledo, okay, it's not going to be able to do that, right? It just doesn't have enough of the pieces and context to go execute on that in completeness. So it requires a human to be involved. And so I think the winning combination is humans that are comfortable with tools. Just like if I use my construction example, the best, kind of contractors today or the best tradesmen today are using all the tools that they have available, both ones that they own, one that they rent, and new ones that come out to sort of get you the best, both efficient and cost effective solution.
So if people continue to evolve and use the systems that we now have available to us, you are not that concerned about job security. You think there will be more stuff that we are doing and new opportunities, or do you think there will be a period of time of adjustment where, what do you think
I
about
mean,
that?
it's change is inevitable. Things are always adjusting. I liken it to like Uber coming into the taxi cab industry, right?
Right.
Everybody's like, well, taxis are going to go away. I'm like, well, in some cities they should go away, right? They were really bad and corrupt, and they were charging inappropriate. And again, the bad apples always get the news, right? Hey, my credit card machine doesn't work. How many times I get in the cab and the guy tells me my credit? I'm like, dude, you just don't want you want me to pay cash, or I get in the cab and I do Google Maps and they take a much longer route, right? So Uber solves like a couple critical problems around that. Now, could you argue that there's less taxi cabs today? Yes. Now, if you refuse to change and you're like, I'm only going to drive a taxi cab the way I've always done it for the last 20 years, then yes, you may be out of a job if your taxi or taxi company goes out of business. But if you want to go drive for one of these ride sharing things, if you want to start your own ride sharing company and use the technology to go have, 5 Ubers and bring drivers onto the platform because you're such a great taxi cab provider, I've talked to many drivers on the Uber platform that used to drove for taxis or used to drive limos independently that are now leveraging these new tools to have a lot more access to customers, to be able to be on or off when they want to, unlimited lead gen and things of that nature. And so I think similarly with these AI tools, there's definitely going to be roles and jobs that are no longer required to be done the way they used to be done. Okay. So then people can either retrain and retool. Now, if you're like saying, hey, I'm only going to do, this specific rote thing that now AI can do in 5 seconds, you refuse to change, yeah, you're going to be out of a job. But like, if you're like, hey, I'm going to learn to use that tool, I'm going to learn to use the electric saw on the construction site and be
Right.
the best at it, you can now upgrade your skills, right? And so I think, and the great thing is, AI will teach you. You're like, hey, this is what I do. This is what I want to do. What would you recommend? Make me a daily lesson. And literally, AI will walk you through that career progression and transition. And so I think some people will come at that willingly and have the ambition to go learn on their own. Other people, I think, might, sadly, will probably be forced to discover that because, they just don't have the independent, ability or capacity to go learn on their own. And so they're going to either, like you said, lose their job and have to go somewhere else. And then they may join a new company. And the first thing the new company's like, well, you need to go through this training plan, right?
Right.
We're going to train you to use AI the way we used to do it, right?
Um, what do you think about the software engineer role in itself? There's a lot of talk about the product engineer, and gone are the days of a software engineer that will just code and I do my user story and that's all I know, and I don't care about the rest. I don't know where this is coming from, where is it going to. And now a lot of positions are kind of collapsing into one, right? The product manager, the software engineer, the designer. Do you see a little bit of that? What's your vision for that role?
Yeah. I definitely see a lot. I see product managers now that can design, they can go use V0 Dev, come up with a prototype, and then you can click the button and deploy it live to Vercel, right? For simple applications. And I think there's many of these kind of Lovable's another one. Replic's obviously another famous one where you can literally go from idea to working complete app that, call it a prototype, call it production. It works. And you can design, there's limitations of what those can and can't do. But a single individual can play all the roles. Now, there's things that those things can't do, right? They can't build the same highly scalable systems that we've built, right? They may not at first be able to learn about all the legacy code. Like I can't take V0 and point it at an application that I've been building on Ruby on Rails for 20 years that has all kinds of custom code in it. V0 won't be that successful, right? Now it could take a screenshot of it and design a new version in React and Next and stuff because that's what it knows, but it may not be able to go do that in a different coding language. So my view is similar to like the classic example of like look at COBOL or Fortran, like very old programming languages that used when I was in college or kind of probably even predating that. There's people that never wanted to learn, and that'll become a small group of people that are working on that. But then we went through the transition of C++ and then Java, And then now, as you know, more people write Node and JavaScript and TypeScript and things of that nature. And so again, you could argue that an engineer that's been in I've been doing this for 25 years, and engineers that I started with 25 years ago versus engineers today, I've had folks that have worked with me all those times, right? There's a gentleman on our team today that when I first met him 25 years ago, he was, sitting in the office across from me. We were writing C++ code. I was the manager, he was writing, but like then he went through an arc where 2 or 3 companies we worked together, he wrote Java code. And then he went through a company, the most recently, it was all Ruby on Rails because that's what the stack was. And now at our new company, it's all TypeScript, right? And Node. And so again, great people are able to adapt, right? And they're able to learn and make changes. And so I think the software engineer that we had a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago is going to look very different than what they look like a year from now or 5 or 10 years from now. And I think the great ones will adapt, and the ones that don't can go do something else or find a different passion that says, hey, I want to do it the old way. There are going to be jobs that'll just be like, hey, for whatever reason, this particular area can't use AI or refuses to use AI, and you can go do it the old way. My sense is those jobs will dry up pretty quickly because honestly, AI is just better at this stuff. It's a very deterministic problem. You're like, hey, I have the code compiler and language hasn't changed. It's fully documented, right? And it's pretty easy to build tests and understand and describe the output when you're doing a digital thing. I'm building something digitally that has a digital output that's connected in this box. It's testable. A lot of software is mockable these days. And so my sense is that AI is going to be a lot more effective than an individual doing it manually. And so my view is, what I tell every software engineer I work with is if you're not using AI every day, you're falling behind, whether you know it or not. And you need to, get yourself into a role that is using a lot of AI, because that's what the future is. And the people that are the best at these tools, just like in the early days, the people that came out and were the best at JSP and the best at Java, they got a lot of jobs when the C++ people had refused to learn. And they're like, oh, I'm still C++. I think Java's a joke. I think, C++ and C is where all the real engineers are. And I think the same thing happened when we went from, Java to Ruby and saying, oh, Ruby's such a joke, or PHP, these interpreted languages are terrible. And then people are like, oh, JavaScript on the server, that's ridiculous. Like that's a, browser language. Why are we doing that on the server? And of course, we've seen, and you can, look at GitHub repos and counts of code, like TypeScript is winning, right? JavaScript is winning. It's where most of the things are happening these days, Python, et cetera, right? And so if you haven't evolved along that line, you're just selling yourself short and giving yourself less opportunity than you could if you were to adapt and try these new tools.
Let's talk a little bit about your experience as a pilot. Did it start because of your father?
I did. Yeah. So we had a little plane growing up. And it's funny. My dad tried to teach the kids to fly a couple times, and we were very resistant. We hated it. He made us study things, and it was like, it's just really hard to learn things from your father, directly, at least in my experience. But then when I got to college, a friend of mine got his instructor's license, and he was like, man, I need my first student. And I'm like, well, I'll be your first student. And because I had so much experience as a kid being around airplanes and practicing and things like that, it was very easy for me to get my license. And so I got my license in a couple months in college, so more than 20 years ago. And then I didn't really do it. I took like a 10-year break, work, family, whatever. And then I got back into it for a few years, and then again took another 10-year break, and then got back into it seriously a few years ago, and then advanced through a bunch of ratings, got my commercial, got my instrument rating, and then most recently got type rated in a larger airplane.
How did the whole pilot thing influence the way that you approach a business and decision making and risk assessment and systems thinking?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the interesting thing, it was, again, I learned from my father, is like, he had more than he could count friends that had died in airplane, being in the aviation, right? So he had friends that died in aviation, in like the Reno air races. He lost a couple friends in, and I think that one stuck with me a little bit, because it's like, hey, they're taking risk, and if you take risk, you're going to have a non-zero chance of, or additional risk, you're going to have a non-zero chance of being, a higher statistic. But I think the one that actually was the most influential, and it's the one I think about every day whenever I go fly, is that he had a lot of his pilot friends, right? So he was a professional pilot, had tens of thousands of hours, both from the military and then from, sort of as a career pilot, airline pilot. A lot of his friends were the same, right? They all had, tens of thousands of hours, had been flying for 10, 20, 30 years, and they'd fly every week, right? And they'd fly a lot. And then had very religious practices, and multiple of their friends' kids died in airplane accidents because the kids like, oh, my dad can do this, I can go fly, and just like me, I got my license relatively quickly because I had a lot of context. But that doesn't make me anywhere near like I'm like 100th safer than somebody who's been doing this for their whole life, flying every day, flying every week. They're just a lot safer, and they're flying planes with a lot more safety and redundancy. They have a second pilot with them at all times. They don't fly alone, right? Um, and so for me, even now where I fly, I don't fly alone. I always fly with a second mentor pilot, just because even though I'm fully licensed, I'm fully certified, I absolutely could fly alone. I don't want to be a statistic. I don't want to show up in the news as like, hey, I was out there and made a bad decision, and I was, second set of eyes and a second experienced brain is incredibly impactful. And so to me, like that's one kind of risk thing. And I think of that in a company. If I was going to start a company today, and we've started several in the last couple months, I would never do it alone. Right? Why? Because you have so much secondary person, and you've been around business and companies. And when you're a solo founder, there's a lot of loneliness, but there's also just a lot of myopic views. We're like, well, I think that's the right. You have nobody to challenge you, nobody to like check you and be like, man, we're going too far down this, or we've wasted too much time on that, or we should, you know, I don't think this person's a good fit, or I do think this person's a great fit, and be able to like, remove some of that selective bias that you're going to have as an individual. And so I think that's probably one lesson is don't go alone. I think the other lesson is, you always, most of the preparedness happens before you get into battle, right? So like the best decisions that you make as a pilot are before you even get in the airplane. Is it a good day to fly? Is the airplane in good shape? Am I in good shape? There's a whole checklist that we run through of like, did I get good sleep last night? Have I had a good meal? Is there not anything I'm worried about or stressed about that's going to like impact my ability to make great decisions? Is the weather good? Where I'm going, where I'm coming from? Any transitions in the chase? Are there risks on the plane? Do I have people in the back that are going to be arguing or, distracting me? And that doesn't seem like a good experience. Like the best decision is don't go, right? And so I think a lot of times in business, spending a little bit of time preparing and thinking ahead makes a big difference. And we have very, religious checklists that we run both pre-flight, during the flight, during start, all these different key segments. And so I think for me, and again, dealing with large teams and outsourcing and things of that nature, I've become, really, really passionate about building SOPs, standard operating procedures that in some levels match what we do in the air, right? Which is like, hey, you want to do this the same every time. And if you learn something new, you change the checklist to say, hey, I made a mistake here before I missed this thing. I want to add 2 steps to make sure I double check this thing. Or, there is a case where this one could slip through the cracks. And most airplane accidents are some version of a Swiss cheese thing where it was a combination of things that had to happen, right? Poor decision making, unlucky failure in the air, bad weather, thing closing, person in front of you, got on the runway for too long. There's, it's all those things, the chain of events that kind of triggered that. And I think business is very similar. Very rarely does one decision in business make, the end is the end, right? Sometimes, but very rarely. Most of the time it's like, oh, I hired the wrong person. I let them work on the wrong project. Oh, I didn't get rid of them. Oh, I took a bad customer. I didn't recognize the pattern of them going in. Oh, I worked on this thing for too long or not enough. I wasn't prepared when I went into the demo. And so I think a lot of that in aviation is important and triggering because if you make a mistake, you die, right? Like the cost of that. And for me, and it's funny, like I was flew with some friends to Austin, they're kind of coworkers. And, we got in the airplane and we took off and we're, leaving and flying down towards Texas. And, 10, 15 minutes on the flight, the guy's like, he's like, I've never seen you like this. Because I'm normally very outspoken thing and crazy ideas. Yeah. And he's like, but when you're in airplane mode, you switch that off and you're like, you're reading your tail number, you're talking to ATC and you're in business mode, right? And I think that's true of like, if we were going to have a serious discussion about business or negotiating something, we would both lock in and focus on that discussion. And I think there's a sense of being able to put the blinders on and be like, this is the task I must put 100% energy on. And I think that, again, in business, there's point in time where you can't be multitasking and working on 10 things. You need to lock in and do that one thing. And I think, I think aviation has a bunch of good lessons to learn from that. And the cost of that is your life, where, in business, it might be the cost of your business. And rarely do the decisions we make are life and death, fortunately.
So systems and processes and checklists are very important. Do they matter the same depending on even if the company is like small or starting or a startup or a huge one, or how do you see that in the different stages of companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the checklists and the processes need to map to the stage and the importance of it, right? The checklist that Air Force One runs when they take off with Donald Trump and the president, very different than the checklist that a student pilot runs when they're taking off for their first flight at a local airport, right? One or two people on board, it's just the thing versus taking off with like, presidential, sort of VIP. And so I think in business it's similar, right? It's like, hey, if I ran the same checklist at our new company with 3 engineers that I ran in processes when we had hundreds of engineers working on a release at Microsoft, it wouldn't make sense, right? We have way more resources at Microsoft that we can focus on the checklist and all the compliance and things. But there's a reason for that, right? Because if we ship a bad Outlook build, hundreds of millions of people are impacted.
Right.
Where at a startup, it may be zero. You might not even have a customer yet. You may not be in a POC. And so you want to balance the amount of effort you put into checking and verifying things to map to the scope and sort of like risk profile of the specific item. So I think the best way to describe that is look at the things you're doing, and the checklist should be additive, not punitive, right? They should make the process better, more complete, more correct, and they're going to be simpler at a startup than they would be at a large company where the risks and the cost of making a mistake is much higher, and so you're going to spend more effort on that. So I think it has to be balanced is the short answer.
Makes sense. And talking about that and Microsoft and Instacart and leading large scale teams, what are some of the key lessons that you learned during those times of leading so big teams?
Yeah, I think it boils down to communication and being able to have a well communicated sort of ability to communicate to a large team, right? And so I think when you're running a team with hundreds of engineers, you can't talk to them every day. And in fact, in some cases, you don't even get to talk to every single one of them every year, right? Because they're in different locations. And this was, pre-COVID where we, did a lot more travel on airplanes to go to offices versus, now we're much used to doing things like this that are on Zoom or remote. And so I think to me, being able to understand what you're communicating, doing it often enough, and then making it clear enough and multi-pathed enough that everybody receives the message. And so sometimes that's communicating through managers, through leadership. Sometimes that's big one-on-ones. But if people don't know where they're going, they're not going to get there. And so being able to communicate where you're going and why is the most important thing, right? And so if you can't do that, all the other things don't matter. Like, why are we doing this? What's the shareholder value? How are we creating value or an impact? And so I think for me, when the teams get large, you need to figure out the right ways to both get feedback from the team on what's working and not working, whether that's small groups, sitting with people at lunch, walking around in the hallways, jumping into random team meetings and stand-ups and things like that. Because at a team that size, it's, there's tens of stand-ups or hundreds of stand-ups, all over the globe in terms of timing. And so I think for me, it's really being able to understand and get good signal from what's happening on the field and in the teams, and then being able to synthesize that and then communicate out, sort of a broad enough message that works. And sometimes it's leading by example, right? You go to these individual meetings and you're giving very direct feedback and very actionable feedback on a sort of a business review or an engineering review. And then from that, people are learning and then taking that and then osmosing that back to the rest of their team or the organization.
Was it a natural transition for you to go from a founder and an entrepreneur to a corporate leader? How did that feel? And did you need to learn stuff when you were doing that?
Yeah, definitely needed to learn. I think the first couple times it was a complete failure. Like when we got acquired from Zimbra into Yahoo, we kind of showed up with this idea of like, hey, we're the startup guys, we're a small, nimble team, we'll just do what we want. We don't worry about the big machine. And I think the mistake there, and a lot of founders make that when they get acquired, is they come in with an ego or a chip on their shoulder that they're like the winner. When the right mindset, and again, it took a couple turns until I realized this going into Microsoft, we came in with like, hey man, we're just here to help. We're advisors. Mentally, I'm no longer the entrepreneur. I'm not running this company. I don't own this thing in the same way that I did. I need to be service to the shareholders and service to the leadership team at the big company. And my job, if anything, is not to defend. So I'll give you two very specific things. So when we went into Yahoo, we all refused to take Yahoo email addresses. We said, do we still want the Zimbra email address? We don't want to change our business cards. In fact, we got reacquired by VMware. We made them print VMware and Zimbra on both sides of the card. We were so into our own brand. And while that kind of makes sense, and you're like, oh, that's cute, you guys are very strong about and passionate about your small thing, that created a lot of animosity inside the company of like, who are these guys to think that they're special and different? And that made it harder to get things done across the organization. Take the example of Acompli going into Microsoft. We deleted and got rid of Acompli on everything as quick as possible, and we became Microsoft whole by whole. I only used Microsoft. My email was Microsoft. All my external stuff said Microsoft. I was all Microsoft. I was there to be helpful and be part of the bigger team and be supportive. And at any moment, if people would say Acompli, I said, no, that was this. We're Outlook Mobile. Like I'm the Outlook Mobile guy. I'm not the Acompli guy. And that made a huge difference in sort of building rapport and trust with broader teams. And people invited us to come talk and give, advice and work through that where that never happened at previous ones. And so I think that's one big mind shift. I think the other one is, to you said, when you get to a big corporate thing, the game is different, right? When you're a startup, the game is like, how do you grow, customers and value and things like that. But if you think about it, the game is the same. When you're at a startup, you're trying to grow shareholder value. You're an equity holder, significantly probably a major one if you've started the company. You're trying to go your equity value, growing the pie, right? When I get to Microsoft, if you think the same way, I'm a shareholder of Microsoft. I'm trying to grow Microsoft shareholder value. Now, from my chair, the percent of what I own of Microsoft and the impact I have is smaller. But if I can't draw a line to shareholder value on what I'm doing every day, I'm making a huge mistake. And so for me, the first thing is like, who am I working with? Who am I working for? What are they doing to drive shareholder value? What's the company's goal and mission? And how can I be part of that? Because that means you're the most aligned, which then means you can communicate to your team to get the most aligned.
Is that your biggest advice to aspiring leaders? Understand where the company is going, wherever you are, understand your position and how you collaborate so that you can help your team collaborate. Is that what you would say to anyone that wants to become a leader?
Absolutely. And everybody should be a leader. I mean, as an individual, the amount of agency and sort of, this notion of like having high agency as an individual now more than ever, right? Everybody should have that entrepreneurial spirit. Everybody should be thinking way above their current role. And what does that mean for them to get to the next level, for them to help the company and be successful? And if you think like that, you're going to be the most valuable to your team, your organization, your company. And whether you're leading as an individual, because you're providing good ideas and sharing results and teaching and learning, or you're leading because you're actually managing a team of other engineers or other folks at the company. Both of those are going to increase your impact if you're sort of taking that lead and sort of understanding where the company's going and you're thinking about that. You're not fighting for your team or your goal or your specific thing. Well, that's helpful, and I think it's one of the biggest things that Satya did when he took over as the CEO is he said, look, the old review model at Microsoft was what did I achieve? Very centralized. Everybody was fighting for what did I achieve? And he switched the goal to say, what did you do to help others? What impact did the other people have based on the work that you did? Hey, I built this new tool, this new system, or I created this, new training mechanism that X number of people used. And because of that, all these other people were lifted up. And if you think of that, Microsoft has over 200,000 employees. If everybody's working on themselves, you have 200,000, individual cylinders firing. But if you have 200,000 people trying to make the other 200,000 people more successful, the impact of that shows. And you can see in the stock price and their success over the last decade that it's undisputable that that's worked.
Kevin, one final random question to you. Besides piloting jets, what do you do when you're not working?
I love working out. I mean, I do my workout every day, nutrition. So just trying to stay healthy. Love spending time with the kids and just finding things that they can do that's exciting. My daughter's a big rock climber, and so she's way better than me. But I enjoy, rock climbing with her. Play pickleball with my son. So I think, kind of mix it up, right? So I think it's really, whatever I can do to hang out with the family when I'm outside of it, because when I'm in work, I'm pretty excited and pretty into it.
Very good, Kevin. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope that we can stay in touch and maybe do so same again in the future.
Love it, man. Thanks for having me.